Hello everyone, this is Chelsea with my 5th presentation on the Florida Keys National Marine Sanctuary. So I will be covering the effects of climate change on environments and biodiversity with ocean acidification and changes in water temperature, as well as human modification of natural areas, involving the history of modification and conservation methods for these areas. And then lastly, I'll be talking about consideration for human livelihood in conservation. The effects that climate change have on the oceans include ocean acidification and changes in water temperature. First, I'll talk about how ocean acidification affects the environment and biodiversity of the Keys, and then I will talk about how changes in water temperature do this too. Ocean acidification is caused from an increased amount of carbon from the atmosphere dissolving in the ocean. Within the Florida Keys National Marine Sanctuary, ocean acidification has an impact on much of the marine life because of its effects on coral. Ocean acidification causes algae to leave polyps on coral, causing the coral to die. The Florida Keys National Marine Sanctuary protects more than 50 species of coral, making ocean acidification have a large impact on the ecosystem of the Keys. Not only does ocean acidification affect corals, but also the organisms that rely on them. So ocean acidification is an effect of climate change that has huge impacts on biodiversity. And according to the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, coral reefs support more species per area than any other marine environment. Corals dying due to ocean acidification results in a loss of support for the many species reliant on the corals. Overall, a loss of biodiversity occurs when this happens. This graph is from the 2011 Florida Keys National Marine Sanctuary Condition Report. You can see when coral bleaching events occurred in the Caribbean Basin and how that affected coral spread. As you can see, there's been a pretty large decrease in absolute percent coral cover from 1977 to 2002. And with such large loss of coral cover, biodiversity also decreases. Changes in water temperature also affects the Florida Keys. Climate change affects the temperature of water, which could affect the Florida Keys ecosystem. Climate change can cause ice to melt, which changes the salinity of water, and that ultimately has an effect on ocean currents and where warm and cool water are being distributed. The Florida Current is a current that carries water from the Caribbean into the Florida Keys. Climate change can change the direction of this current, causing the water in the Florida Keys to become cooler. And as water temperatures get cooler, organisms are no longer in their ideal habitat, which causes them to want to move to an area that's more favorable. These effects on ocean currents can negatively affect biodiversity. In this map, you can see the sea surface temperatures around the world, and you can also see that the Florida Keys water is very warm, making it a favorable environment for species that thrive in warm temperatures. If the ocean started getting cooler, that would alter the habitat of species who live maybe closer to the poles than the Florida Keys. And this change in species distribution would cause species to migrate towards the Florida Keys in order to seek warmer water. And this would change the ecosystem structure as a new species is introduced into an ecosystem. New species can have overlapping niches with species native to the Florida Keys. And if the new species is competitively dominant over the native species, then the native species becomes at risk of extirpation, which can cause a very large change in the ecosystem of the Florida Keys. Human-modified areas are areas that people have changed the ecological structure of in order to better suit our needs. For example, turning an area into a field that we grow food on would be a human-modified area. These areas create conservation issues because they change the ecosystem of an area and destroy habitat. As urban sprawl is growing, conservation of biodiversity in human-modified areas is becoming even more important. The mangrove forests and the beaches of the Florida Keys National Marine Sanctuary have been affected by human modification. Historically, there has been modification of mangrove forests in Florida. As the human population of Florida increased, there is a need for expanded urban area. In order to gain this, mangrove forests were sacrificed. Many mangrove forests have been lost because they were dredged and filled in order to allow for other land uses. And this is a picture of a mangrove forest that was dredged in Cambodia. Now, we know that dredging and filling mangrove forests has a lot of negative environmental consequences, so there are laws and regulations that have been developed to prevent this from happening again. In Florida, it's now illegal to damage mangrove forests anywhere along the coast. A way that humans have impacted the ecosystem of the Florida Keys is by the use of beaches as areas of recreation. Some areas along the coast of Florida get very crowded by tourists, which impacts organisms that use beaches either for habitat or for laying eggs, as well as organisms in the water that are impacted by human disturbance while recreating or by pollution coming from beaches. Sea turtles lay their eggs on beaches and then return to the water, and when the turtles hatch, they have to find their way to the water. This can all be impeded by human use of beaches. The Florida Keys National Marine Sanctuary is home to 5 species of sea turtles, some of which are endangered. This picture is from a beach in Costa Rica, where a lot of tourists came to watch sea turtles lay their eggs. And these tourists disrupted the turtles by taking flash pictures, touching the turtles, and laying or stepping on their nests. And eventually these turtles had to go back into the water and could not lay their eggs in this location. Disturbances to beaches can be minimized by closing areas of beaches from public access, either year-long or between times in which sea turtle eggs are laid and hatched. Conservation of sea turtles could also involve public education, where there's education for people about the dangers of interrupting the life cycles of turtles. Currently, there are areas within the Florida Keys National Marine Sanctuary that are being conserved in this way. The Boca Grande Key Wildlife Management Area employs this method by limiting public access to half of the beach on these management areas in order to protect endangered and at-risk birds who use the beach as their habitat. The Florida economy is a factor that is important to consider when planning for conservation. The marine sanctuary is a benefit to the economy because of its role as a place for fishing and tourism. According to analysis of socioeconomics and the marine sanctuary conducted by the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, the sanctuary makes up 58% of the local Florida Keys economy with recreation and tourism, and 8.8% of all employment in the Florida Keys comes from the fishing industry. The marine sanctuary and the economy both support each other and are closely connected. Large appeals of the Florida Keys National Marine Sanctuary are the recreational activities, aesthetic appreciation, and fishing opportunities. Conservation supports the continued ability for people to participate in these things. The economy gives back to the sanctuary with funding for science and for conservation. A priority is placed on supporting the sanctuary's conservation efforts because the maintenance of the ecosystem of the Florida Keys directly influences the profitability of the sanctuary and therefore influences the Florida Keys economy. The Florida Keys National Marine Sanctuary is in a place where people do not directly rely on the area, and some people fish, but that's either commercial or sports fishing. And people that work in the tourism and fishing industries in the sanctuary should be considered personally because they depend on their jobs to earn an income. And these are all of my works cited. Thank you.